Hello and welcome to the March Crane Research Forum. Thank you for joining us today. We're so glad that you're here. My name is Dr. Rebecca Dorr. I'm the Director of Research here at the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. My colleague Kathy is going to be monitoring our chat box today, and we'll be adding housekeeping items there, so keep an eye on that. These monthly forums host regular research on emerging or key topics that impact the field of early childcare and education. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Hadley. Dr. Hadley is an associate professor of literacy studies at the University of South Florida. Her research centers on language and early literacy development in pre-K classrooms. She's passionate about creating learning opportunities that are intentional and equitable, specifically for children who come from marginalized communities or families experiencing poverty. Dr. Hadley's been published in top journals and won awards, including the Early Career Award from the American Educational Research Association. Her work also includes a high degree of community-engaged scholarship with active collaborations with local school districts and community organizations in her area. Today, Dr. Hadley will discuss how the language and literacy development of children was impacted for those whose pre-kindergarten learning experiences were disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm looking forward to this discussion very much. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Hadley.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Dorr, for that introduction. I am just thrilled to be here today. Thank you to the Crane Center for hosting me and for giving me the chance to talk with all of you a little bit about some of the COVID impacts that our early childhood population has experienced. So I'm going to start just with a little overview of my talk. There we go. So here's what I'll be talking about today. So first, I'm going to start a little bit with kind of the big picture and an introduction about what we all have been through over the last several years. I'll talk a little bit about young children's school experiences during COVID based on the research. And then I'll move into a specific study that I did with my colleagues where we looked at the impact of COVID disruptions on language and literacy for a specific population of kids. And that's the kids whose pre-K year was interrupted by COVID. So they started their pre-K year in 2019. And then we followed them over time through the end of first grade to really get a good look at what happened to these young children when COVID disrupted their schooling. And then I'll finish with some next steps and some implications and some lessons to learn. And then I'll be interested in hearing your questions and your thoughts and your contributions in terms of what you experienced during this time period and what you're seeing in the children that you work with now, for those of you who are teachers. All right, the big picture. Okay, not to bring us back, but just a quick reminder about sort of what things looked like at the time and then how kind of learning loss has been characterized since then. So this is a very early news headline from March 17th, 2020. Schools are closing for coronavirus. Remember when we used to call it coronavirus? And they ask, now what? And that was kind of the question we all had at the time. Now what, right? Teachers had to move into remote instruction really quickly. And then a couple of kind of post-COVID, if we can call it that, headlines. So the research is beginning to come out about what the impacts of COVID were and are continuing to be. So here's one of those headlines. The pandemic has had devastating impacts on learning. What will it take to help students catch up? And that's from March of 2022. And I would say that that's still an open question at this point. And then finally, from January of 2023, this headline says students lost 1/3 of a school year to pandemic, study finds. So to date, a lot of the research studies have kind of had takeaways like this, right? That students across the nation have lost 1/3 of a school year to the pandemic. But what does that really mean? Which students are we talking about? How did things vary for different kinds of students and for different kinds of language and literacy skills? We don't really have a lot of detailed, nuanced answers to those questions yet in the research community, at least. So a few unanswered questions. Really, we want to understand how young children's learning was impacted by COVID. A lot of these national studies are looking at kids who are in third grade or older during the pandemic, because those are the kids who take standardized assessments for the most part. So there's not much out there about younger children just because there's not as much data available. There have been very few studies that have looked at kids who were young during the worst of the COVID impacts. It's also not clear which language and literacy skills were impacted the most. Were some differentially impacted? Were some impacted more? Were some impacted less? What do we need to work on, right? How did remote learning play a role? We know remote learning is really can be extremely challenging with young children. We know that for older children, remote learning appeared to, hold some children back at least. But what was the role of remote learning for young kids and COVID impacts? And then also looking at kind of some of these child characteristics. Race, ethnicity, income, disability status, how did those affect children's learning during this COVID time? So that's what we'll be talking about today. And, the specific focus for this presentation is this kind of early childhood group. So kids who are in pre-K during that 2019-2020 year, and then we're kind of following them through the end of first grade, through the worst of the COVID impacted years. And why is it important to follow these kids? I probably don't need to argue to all of you how important the early childhood period is. But we all know that early childhood is this critical window during which kids are developing language, they're developing academic skills, they're building their self-regulation, they're really working on and developing their socio-emotional skills and their ability to kind of, be part of a classroom community, interact with peers, and learn how to do school. But as I mentioned earlier, we just don't have much information about COVID impacts for this group of learners. And in particular, we want to know more about their language and literacy skills, because that's really considered the cornerstone of later academic achievement, right? We can't acquire new knowledge if we're not able to read. Okay, so just a little bit of background about kids' learning experiences during the years that I'll be going through in this presentation. So 2019 through 2020, of course, are the years schools shut down. Nationwide, all but one school district was closed, and schools on average were closed for about 8 instructional days. So like fully closed, no remote instruction, no nothing. And that varied nationwide, right? Some were closed for more, some were closed for less. And as you know all too well, if you were teaching during this time, teachers were all of a sudden asked to just provide remote instruction with almost no time to prepare, very few resources, very little infrastructure. So there were a lot of challenges, of course, during this time period. Everybody, parents, teachers, everyone was just kind of doing the best they could, right? There were problems with attendance, of course. Early childhood educators reported that they had trouble engaging children in online sessions. So, if you were one of those teachers who was trying to teach pre-K or kindergarten children on a Zoom session during this time, thank you for your service. But overall, there really wasn't a lot of synchronous instruction in early childhood settings. Teachers reported that they mostly posted materials online or handed out activity packets, and then maybe only actually met with students in person about once a week, according to a survey. Teachers also reported that there really weren't many opportunities to engage in conversations, of course, because we were remote, talk about books, and then do any kind of interactive or hands-on activities. Of course, we could ask parents to do those things, but parents are also trying to, in many cases, work and parent and teach children at the same time. So it was a difficult time, right? Then we had 2020 to 2021, which is really a year where there was a lot of hybrid and remote instruction happening. Most children nationwide began fall 2020 as remote learners. About 40% of school districts offered in-person instruction. And you'll see that that's a little bit different in our district that we studied. Continuing difficulties with engagement and attendance. We did a study of the apps and digital resources that pre-K teachers shared with their students and with their families. And we found that for the most part, they really focused on kind of discrete, narrow skills like letter knowledge, and they didn't necessarily help support kids' comprehension or their vocabulary or some more of those unconstrained skills. So kids were getting, some more narrow learning experiences during this time. We also had other disruptions to learning, like quarantines, illness, lots of teacher staffing difficulties. We had those social distancing and disease mitigation measures to keep everybody healthy, but they also meant that we couldn't do some of the same activities that we would normally do, where kids are in small groups and face to face. And there were really high rates of teacher stress, burnout, and high workloads as well, because teachers were being asked to do all of these new things that they wouldn't normally do in a typical year. Okay, and then finally, 2020 through 2021, the year things returned to normal. Question mark, right? Because there's some lasting impacts, and even in this year, although the vast majority of schools were back to in-person learning, there was also chronic absenteeism from teachers and children. COVID-related school closures and quarantines still occurred. Super high rates of teacher burnout continuing. And in a recent study, they found that this was particularly associated with a lack of administrative support. So teachers not feeling supported by their administrators during all of these COVID changes. And then interestingly, teacher burnout was also associated with the use of learning management systems, right? So things like Canvas or Blackboard. If teachers weren't given support to learn how to use these kind of online systems, they reported feeling really burned out. Teachers also reported that about half of their students were behind grade level, so more than in previous years. Teachers reported as well that their students needed more mental health support than before the pandemic. Okay, so in some ways, this year was a return to normal, and in some ways, we're still feeling these impacts of COVID. And then we have beyond the post-COVID years, right? Some lasting educational changes in a post-COVID world. And I'm interested in hearing from all of you kind of the changes that you're seeing in the children that you work with. I've noticed changes in my college students pre and post COVID. So I think, we had this kind of seismic event in our world, and it especially disrupted education. So of course, there's going to be some resulting changes. So are there long-term impacts on kids' learning trajectories? Are there long-term impacts on their socio-emotional development? What are the behavioral impacts? We have, younger children than the ones we'll talk about in this presentation, but we have the COVID babies who didn't interact with a lot of people when they were super little in those baby and toddler years. And we know that that interaction is kind of a cornerstone of kids' development. So what does it look like when those kids are coming into pre-K and coming into kindergarten now? And then finally, school districts made tremendous amount of investments in remote instruction infrastructure, in apps, in digital resources, in tech resources, right? So it's there now, and it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle, even if we wanted to. So it raises the question of how do we use these resources with young children in responsible and developmentally appropriate ways? And is any form of remote instruction appropriate for young children? It's certainly become a much more common option for older children. And, there's some political will to make it an option for younger children as well. So is that a good idea? Okay, so now I'm going to move in more specifically into our study that we conducted. And this is called the Impacts of COVID School Disruptions on Language and Literacy. So our questions of interest were, we wanted to look long-term, what's happening for these kids over the course of a couple of years, right? Following the same children over time, which can be a little difficult to do because a lot of times, like, kids will be in pre-K and then move to kindergarten, but we can't track them from pre-K into kindergarten, right? In our particular sample, kids were attending the same school in pre-K and kindergarten, so we are able to kind of track them across time. Oftentimes that's kind of hard to do in this research. The second thing we wanted to do is dig a little deeper into the kinds of skills that might be impacted by COVID. So we'll look at constrained skills versus unconstrained skills. And if you're not familiar with those terms, I'm going to explain them in just a moment. And then finally, we wanted to look at how remote instruction played a role, and then how some different child characteristics might have played a role in the impacts of COVID. Okay, so constrained versus unconstrained skills. So constrained skills, oops, let me not do that. So constrained skills are ones that are kind of on the left-hand side of that figure at the bottom, right? So you can see the continuum of constraint. So constrained skills are constrained because you can think of them as kind of like fitting in a little box or something, right? There's a limited number of items. They can be mastered, right? There's a ceiling to mastery of these items, and they can be learned in a relatively short time frame. So for example, writing your name. You only have so many letters in your name, right? Maybe you're like perfecting your letter formation, but for the most part, you learn how to write your name and then you're done. You don't need to keep learning it. Same with letters of the alphabet. You learn the letters in the alphabet, you learn their names, you learn the sounds that are associated with them, and then you don't have to keep learning that, right? It's not like they're hopefully, unless in special cases, you're not still teaching that in high school, you're not still learning it as an adult, you're done, right? And then unconstrained skills are ones that are a little more open in their scope. There's basically an unlimited number of items when it comes to unconstrained skills. You learn them across a lifetime, and you're never fully going to master an unconstrained skill. So vocabulary is an example of this. You can always learn a new word. There are constantly new words being invented, right? If you think about like slang and the way people use language and how it evolves over time. So you'll never hit like a ceiling of final mastery points when it comes to vocabulary. And the same thing with comprehension. There's always new kinds of text to comprehend. There's always different ways you can interpret them, right? And so we need both constrained skills and unconstrained skills when it comes to our reading development. We need phonics. We need to know the letters of the alphabet. We also need vocabulary and comprehension to understand what we read, right? So it's really essential that teachers teach both. Constrained skills tend to be a little easier to teach. It's a little more of a checklist. You can assess that kids have learned it or they haven't, whereas comprehension and vocabulary can be harder to assess. And it's taught through kind of these more holistic activities like shared book reading, conversations, hands-on activities, right? Okay, so that's constrained versus unconstrained. So here's a little bit more about our study. So we partnered with a local school district, very large urban and suburban school districts, and we chose two cohorts of children. So we are looking at 89 schools. Our district was here in Florida, where I am in West Central Florida, and that's important to know because we all know that Florida during COVID was kind of a special case. These children attended the state-funded pre-K program, which we call VPK here, kindergarten and first grade, and public elementary schools. And so we have these two cohorts. One of them was pre-COVID because we wanted to be able to compare like what's kind of typical. What do kids typically get when their instruction is not interrupted by a global pandemic, right? So we followed those children. We had about 1,000 of them, and we followed them starting in 2016 to 2017. Our COVID cohorts, they missed about 9 weeks of in-person school the first year in their pre-K year. The next year in kindergarten, they could choose to attend online or face-to-face. Face-to-face school was an option for them throughout the school year, okay? And some kids kind of like moved in and out a little bit. And then first grade was fully in-person instruction, okay? And then we stopped following them at the end of 2022. And this is why, because our pre-COVID cohorts starting in their second grade year started to experience COVID. So that's why that was kind of our endpoint. So here's just like what it looked like comparing our two COVID cohorts over time. Okay. So our research design is basically we're just comparing these two groups of students, right? So we compared their literacy scores throughout kindergarten and we compared their literacy scores throughout first grade. And this allowed us to figure out exactly what the impact of COVID was by comparing these two groups of kids, right? And for, any research nerds in the audience, we used propensity score methods and matched kids in the pre-COVID cohort to the COVID cohort. And that just makes sure we're kind of comparing apples to apples, that the kids weren't super different on any kind of like assessment data or on their demographic data, that we were making a fair comparison and that we could really be sure that any differences in their scores was because of COVID and wasn't because of some other factor. Okay, so we followed their language and literacy development over time during these COVID years. These were like kind of the different testing time points that we had. And I just wanted to show you this because I wanted to tell you that our first time points, fall of the kindergarten year, was a different assessment. So every kid in Florida takes a different assessment in fall of their kindergarten year, because they want to gauge like their kindergarten readiness, right? So within the first 30 days of school, they take what's called the flickers, okay? So that was the assessment in fall of K. And then the rest of the assessments at different time points were all the MAP growth reading assessments, okay? So throughout kindergarten and then in their fall years. So first, we looked at these kids who had just missed 9 weeks of pre-K, essentially. We wanted to see at kindergarten entry, did they look any different from the pre-COVID group? And we sort of expected to see fairly large impacts, right? Because these kids had been out of school for a good chunk of the spring. But what we actually saw was that there were no negative impacts for the COVID children in the fall of kindergarten, right? We actually saw that the COVID cohort kids actually performed slightly better than the pre-COVID cohorts at this time point, and just in the fall of kindergarten, right? And there could be a variety of reasons for this. It could be that, 9 weeks just wasn't quite enough to move the needle. It also could be that Florida VPK is not a super well resourced public pre-K program, right? And it's not rated as being particularly high quality. So again, it might be that that Florida pre-K program might not be doing enough to support children's academic learning, that we saw a difference at kindergarten entry between the pre-COVID and the COVID kids. We did see that the COVID cohort children especially performed better on the alphabetic principal domain and the concept of word domain. And we know that there were a lot of activities sent home about letter knowledge and about these more constrained skills. So it could be that's especially why we saw kids really kind of learning those more like discrete kind of constrained skills during this time. Okay, so the rest of the results are going to be for winter, spring of kindergarten, fall, winter, spring of first grade. Okay, so let me just go ahead and move through those. Okay, so let me kind of walk you through this graph. All right, so these are the rest of the time points: winter of kindergarten, spring of kindergarten, fall of first grade, winter of first grade, and spring of first grade. So what we're seeing here is the difference in scores between our pre-COVID kids and our COVID kids. So basically, the larger this number, the worse the COVID cohort did. Okay, so you can think of this number as kind of like the amount of learning loss that occurred on language and literacy. And so you can see at winter of kindergarten, it's like less than a point's difference. Okay, so we're not seeing like big amount of learning loss here. But unlike our fall time points, the COVID cohort is doing a little worse here than their pre-COVID peers. Spring of kindergarten, less than half a point, pretty minimal differences here. But then children go away for the summer and they come back and we start to see some larger and more alarming differences in the amount of learning loss kids experienced. So about 2 points in the fall of grade 1, 3.5 points winter of grade 1, and then almost 4 points by the spring of grade 4. Okay, so this is a difference of about just about 4 points, just a little bit under that. So a couple of kind of takeaways for this. The gaps that we're seeing here at the end of first grade, these almost 4 point gaps, those are actually quite a bit larger, almost double than those reported for older children at the end of 2022. Um, and I also wanted to point out that these gaps appear to be widening over time rather than narrowing, right? The difference between the COVID and the pre-COVID kids are actually getting bigger, where we would hope that, in this kind of normal year, the 2021-2022 year, we would be providing a lot of remediation and intervention, and that these gaps would be narrowing over time. Now, it may just be that we're not seeing that yet, right? But for older kids, we are starting to see that pattern of narrowing. By spring 2022, the growth rates are increasing for older kids and the gaps are starting to narrow. Okay, so it may be happening now, but at least at this point, we saw that for these older kids, this kind of widening of gaps. And so it's really important to be able to arrest this pattern that we're seeing, this widening pattern that we're seeing, because, reading difficulties tend to kind of snowball or spiral over time, right? Where kids will have difficulty reading text and then they have less exposure and encounters with text because they don't want to read it, because they're not reading as quickly and they're not picking up books as much, and maybe they're not even getting exposure to more complex texts. So over time, they're getting less exposure to academic language, less exposure to vocabulary. They're not building their background knowledge through texts. And then that leads to more difficulty comprehending texts, right? They start to feel like they're not good at reading. They're not understanding what they're reading. They have less motivation to read. And then they have, again, less exposure and encounters with text. So from the research, we know that it can be pretty difficult to correct children's, to remediate children's reading after kind of the early elementary years. And so it's very important that we kind of arrest this downward spiral and that we start to try to narrow these gaps that we're seeing. Okay, next we wanted to dig in a little bit more and see what's happening in terms of specific skills. So just to kind of orient you to all these different colors, this graph is exactly the same as the previous one. All we did is kind of broke it out into the 4 different subdomains on the map reading. So if you look at this from kind of top to bottom, the yellow color is comprehension. Okay, so comprehension skills, the subtest that tested that. Blue is vocabulary. This gray is like grammar, writing, convention spellings, or spelling conventions and punctuation. And then the orange is phonics and foundational skills, okay? So what we see here in winter of kindergarten, they're all kind of clustered together, right? We're anywhere from like 0.5 point to 1 point amount of learning loss. Spring of kindergarten, similar. You'll see, interestingly, phonics and foundational skills, kids were about the same as they were pre-COVID, right? Really no differences there. But then again, kids go away for the summer, they come back in the fall, and it kind of all expands out, right? And what we see here is that the phonics and foundational skills and the grammar and writing, there aren't as big of differences here, right? We don't have as large amounts of learning loss, especially for grammar and writing. Now, comprehension, we're starting to get above 2 points difference, and vocabulary, we're seeing about 4.5 points difference between the pre-COVID and COVID kids. So notice there are certain types of skills here that look like they're more impacted than others. And think to yourself, what are the difference between these kinds of skills, the ones that are more impacted versus less impacted? The ones on the bottom that are less impacted are more constrained skills, right? And the ones that are more impacted on the top are more unconstrained. So by the end of first grade, we can see that comprehension, look at this yellow line for comprehension, is just going up, up, up. So that's about like a 5.6 point difference in comprehension skills, 5.6 points of learning loss. And then the vocabulary is about 4.5 points. So it's about double the points on the learning loss and comprehension and vocabulary versus these constrained skills is about double. Okay, so we have like kind of this clear pattern here where unconstrained skills have been impacted more by COVID than the constrained ones. So, what does this mean? Well, first of all, it is important to note that all the language and literacy skills were negatively impacted by COVID, right? But the unconstrained skills seem to be impacted even more. And when you think about kids' experiences during the COVID years, this maybe isn't that surprising, right? For unconstrained skills, we know the things that promote it are these highly interactive activities, conversations about books, conversations about topics beyond the here and now, collaborative play, interacting with peers, especially peers who maybe are a little more advanced in their language, hands-on science activities. A lot of these things just weren't possible during at least some of COVID, right? And so these children may have just had fewer of these experiences, not only in school, but also outside of school. They're not really having, maybe as many play dates. They're not interacting with other kids maybe quite as much. And we know that some of the digital resources they used really focused on constrained rather than unconstrained skills from the study that we conducted. So kids just had some fundamentally different kinds of learning experiences, and we're seeing that reflected in the way their language and literacy skills are developing. All right. I also wanted to point out that, the gaps in grammar, phonics, and vocabulary kind of appear to be leveling off, but the gaps in comprehension appear to be continuing to grow, right? Again, this is just a few time points, so it's hard to make, a lot of generalization, but that's kind of the pattern that we're seeing here anyways. And so, this is concerning because comprehension skills are really essential as kids move into elementary school and they're expected to learn from texts, right? They're actually expected to take knowledge from what they're reading, not just to kind of be able to decode the words on the page. Comprehension gaps, they might be a signal that kids' underlying skills are weak or impaired in some way. If you look at the simple view of reading, which says that reading comprehension is the product of word recognition, which is like decoding skills, basically phonics, phonemic awareness, but also language comprehension, which covers unconstrained skills like comprehension, vocabulary, language concepts. We know that if kids have any weakness in either of these areas, it's going to show up in weaker reading comprehension, right? So seeing this reading comprehension really be impacted might be a signal not only that we need to support kids' reading comprehension better, but also there may be some of these underlying competencies that really need some extra support in order for kids to be successful readers into middle school and beyond. Okay, we also wanted to dive a little bit into the role of remote learning. And so Florida was a little bit different during COVID. All districts were required to offer 5-day in-person instruction in the 2020-2021 school year. So you can see for our kids at the beginning of the year, we had about like 42% of our kids chose to learn remotely. And then by the end of the year, only 10% of them were still learning remotely. And you can see that there was some movement over the course of the year. We had like a mid-year data point about what kind of instruction they were engaged in, and some of them made the switch from online to face-to-face, and then a very small percentage of them changed from face-to-face to online, about 6%. So really, this is a pretty minimal amount of remote learning compared to other districts in the US. So just wanted to point that out. So what we did is that we wanted to kind of figure out whether remote learning was the primary reason children's language and literacy scores suffered over time. So this graph is really similar to the other ones that I've showed you. It's showing the difference between the pre-COVID and the COVID children. And these numbers represent basically the amount of learning loss, that difference in scores, right? So the blue line is just like our previous results. This is our full sample of COVID children whether they were remote learners or whether they were face-to-face learners. But in order to understand a little bit more about the role of remote learners, we pulled out the kids who were face-to-face throughout their kindergarten year. Okay, so that's the purple line right here. So we compared these pre-COVID kids, these pre-COVID kids to the post-COVID kids who only spent kindergarten learning face-to-face. And so you can see that in general, these kids who are only face-to-face, their general pattern of COVID impacts is about the same throughout first grade, right? But they did do a little bit better. Their learning loss is slightly less than our full sample, right? And so this suggests that remote learning probably, well, it wasn't the only reason that students' language and literacy scores were impacted by COVID. But the kids who are face-to-face experienced kind of like a buffering effect, or maybe their impacts weren't quite as severe because they had that in-person instruction throughout kindergarten as compared to their peers. So I think I just said this, but remote learning wasn't the only reason for COVID learning losses, but it was helpful for children to attend kindergarten face-to-face versus any amount of remote learning. The kids who attended face-to-face kindergarten did do better than their peers. And as I mentioned earlier, we didn't have a ton of remote learning in our school district. Remote learning that was implemented district-wide in other places did have larger negative impacts on kids' learning. And we know that from this Goldhaber study that did kind of a national study of the impacts of remote learning. So I definitely suggest checking that out. This is also kind of looking at older students though. All right, and then finally, we looked at the role of child characteristics. So some other studies have found that, children who are going to school in high poverty districts or districts where there are higher percentages of minoritized children suffered more negative impacts of COVID. We actually did not find that in this study, and it could be because our sample was actually already very high poverty. About 70% of kids qualified for free and reduced price lunch. And we had higher percentages of minoritized children than on average. So it may have been that we just didn't have a lot of variation in our district, that unfortunately, many of the children in our district suffered the same kinds of impacts. We did see that children who had a diagnosed language disability had slightly larger negative impacts than kids who did not. But I want to caveat that with a very large grain of salt because we only had about 25 children in our sample who were diagnosed with a language disability in kindergarten post-COVID. And that compares to about 150 who were diagnosed with a language disability pre-COVID. So that actually points to a really important thing that we saw in our sample was that we saw that very few children were actually diagnosed with disabilities post-COVID as compared to our pre-COVID sample. So 125 children had an IEP post-COVID and 416 had an IEP pre-COVID. Right. So that points to one really, really striking negative impact of COVID is that many children were not diagnosed and that many children did not receive the services they needed or didn't receive them until much later on than they should have. Okay, so some next steps and lessons learned. I'm going to move through this in about 5 minutes so that we have some time to take some questions and discuss together. So I want to point out that there was huge variation in districts in the amount of COVID learning loss recovery. This study just came out from Stanford in January, and it does a really nice job of giving the big picture, right? But it also points out how important it is to know what's happened in individual districts because the national average at this point isn't incredibly helpful. We need to understand what's happening in our community and the kinds of skills and the different grade levels that were impacted and understanding and unpacking some more of those details and nuances. So in some districts, students' learning has fully recovered. That's especially the case for some older kids. But in others, students have fallen further behind. So the things that seem to be making a difference are tutoring programs, hiring more staff, so instructional coaches, social workers, educational assistants who teach small groups, tutoring during school breaks. And then in general, school districts with more resources are recovering more quickly, which is sort of what we would expect. Unfortunately, a lot of the funds that school districts got, only about 20% were allocated towards supporting academic recovery. And so, I think we need more resources. It takes a lot to be able to support kids. We know that, from pre-COVID research, that there are a lot of reading interventions that can and do make a substantial difference for kids in elementary school. But that requires districts and policymakers to commit those resources. Um, a couple of lessons learned. I think there are likely important developmental differences in how COVID impacted children of different ages. And that's not always recognized in the larger discourse about COVID. School and having that experience of in-person school supports different competencies at different ages. And for young children who aren't reading independently and who need adults to provide a model of more mature language use, it makes a really significant difference for them not to be in that space interacting face to face with teachers and peers. That has consequences for development, right? So interruptions to young children's learning trajectories may have also disrupted the construction of these key foundational elements that kids really need for their later success in reading and then also across academic areas. So I would argue that this early childhood population, whose essentially entire school career has been in this post-COVID landscape, they should be our top priority for concentrating resources, instruction, and intervention. I also wanted to just raise the point about the use of technology. What role can technology play in kids' language and literacy learning, and what role should it play? I think we saw in our study about the apps that pre-K teachers used, that teachers really needed guidance in the selection and use of resources. There were some apps and digital resources that we saw could be used to support some unconstrained skills. So Epic is kind of, a digital library. Seesaw, you can record all different types of interactive activities. YouTube, you can watch read alouds. But should they be used for this purpose? Is a YouTube read aloud really the same thing as a read aloud in which a teacher is working with their class and scaffolding their understanding of a story, right? A YouTube read aloud can't really do that. They don't know the kids that are in front of them. And then can apps and digital resources successfully be used to support constrained skills? Should they be used for this purpose and in which situation, right? It can be a really good help for remediation and for practicing these skills. But when do we use them and when do we not use them? How can adults mediate and scaffold the use of technology, which we know is important? And then we also need to think about how much screen time is appropriate in school, given that there have been really huge increases in screen time outside of school. Dr. Doerr's study found that, low-income kindergartners during COVID were spending more than 6 hours a day using media. And that was during remote learning, of course. But again, there's, this generation of kids who's really used to spending a lot of time online and interacting with apps. So overall, I think our studies during this COVID time give us a peek into what happens when in-person typical instruction is disrupted and really helps us think about the role of school for young children. And I think our results argue that in-person instruction for young kids is really important, especially for supporting unconstrained skills. In-person schooling is also important for identifying and providing services for kids with disabilities. Our results showed that kindergarten was especially essential in children's language and literacy development. And finally, I think these results speak to the power of interaction and the importance of both teachers and peer classroom communities in supporting the development and learning of young children. Okay, so that's all I have. I just wanted to thank my co-authors in this work. I also wanted to thank the Spencer Foundation and AERA who helped to fund this work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your presentation, Dr. Hadley. We have a lot of questions coming in the Q&A box. If you do have another question for Dr. Hadley, we'll have about 15 minutes here to get some of those questions answered. So please continue to add them there. I'll start with some questions people had about your methodology of your study and some of the results that you showed us today. One question was whether the children in your sample included children in charter schools in Florida or just in public schools. Can you say a little bit more about what schools and programs those children are coming from?
Sure. So our kids were, Florida has their VPK funding, which is available to support both private or community providers as well as pre-Ks that are within public elementary schools. And so for this particular study, so that we were able to follow kids over time, we looked at children who specifically attended pre-K within a public elementary school. And so we didn't look at any charter schools. We only looked at like one of our local school districts and children who went to pre-K within those public elementary schools. And there is research that suggests that pre-Ks that are within public elementary schools are of relatively higher quality than ones that aren't, because they're sort of part of that whole, the whole infrastructure there. I don't think that our results necessarily showed that, but it's just another consideration to keep in mind when we're thinking about how these results generalize.
Absolutely. Thank you. And then one question was about how your pre-COVID cohort compared to other pre-COVID cohorts. So you picked that one obviously based on the timing, but was that sort of
Yes.
representative of what previous cohorts looked like in terms of their scores and change over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was very similar over time. Florida likes to change which standardized tests they use pretty frequently. So we were really only able to see like a few years of children that took the same assessments as the cohort that we chose. But yes, the scores were all within a similar range for the cohort that we picked versus the other pre-COVID cohorts.
Excellent. Thank you. And then we had some questions about the tool that you used, and I know you touched on it briefly, but could you say a little bit more, provide a little bit more detail for folks about the reading measure that you used and what that looked like when children were taking the assessment?
Yes. So we had kind of like three different assessments that we used. So the first one was the VPK assessment, and that's something that all kids who are attending VPK in Florida take like 3 times during the year. And so that one is wasn't really used in our analyses per se, except that it was used in our propensity score models so that we could make sure that we were sort of making adjustments for our cohort skills at baseline, right? So we could make sure that our kids who are in the pre-COVID cohort were similar to our COVID cohort kids. And then after COVID happened, for our COVID cohorts, we had data on their Flickers assessment, which is their kindergarten readiness assessment. That was the STAR early literacy assessment, which is used pretty widely. We have a paper that came out about just our results from that STAR literacy assessment. So please check that out if you're interested. It's an educational researcher. It's Hadley, Liu, and Kim and McKenna. And that one, looked at the STAR early literacy in the fall of their kindergarten year, right after they started kindergarten. And then the rest of them used the MAP growth reading, and we looked at both the RIT scores and then also the subdomain scores in those 4 areas that we talked about that the school district chose to examine further. And if I see some more technical questions, I can't answer all of them. But I certainly can put you in contact with my colleague, Dr. Unsuk Kim, who did the detailed statistical analyses for for this paper.
Great. So it's referring to the standard errors and the effect sizes and things like
Yeah.
that. Okay, great. Well, we can definitely provide that information later.
Mhm.
Excellent. Um, One other question some folks had was about the role of pre-kindergarten. So it sounds like all these kids were in this pre-kindergarten program
Mhm.
during the early years of COVID, but in Ohio, pre-K is not mandatory. So how could we compare the COVID cohort to kids who didn't go to pre-K at all? Do you have any sort of like intuitions or thoughts about speculations about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, pre-K is not mandatory in Florida either. It's called voluntary pre-K, but most children do attend because a certain amount of the pre-K is funded. I do think it's kind of interesting to reflect on. The results, our initial results really gave me pause, I'll be honest. To see that the COVID kids actually did a little better than the pre-COVID kids.
Mhm.
To see that like 9 weeks of pre-K didn't make much of a difference and that maybe they did a little better when they were, home with someone during those 9 weeks made me sort of question exactly, the value of pre-K for kids' language and literacy learning. Of course, there's a lot of other factors that go into it, but I also want to note that like Florida's VPK program is really underfunded, and it's consistently rated as amongst the lowest quality programs in sort of national rankings. So I think for us in Florida, the initial results should really be an impetus to do better with our VPK programs, right? I think they're a signal that we're likely not doing enough to support kids in those programs, and that they need to be higher quality if they're going to move the needle for kids. So that's what I would say. I'm not exactly, I mean, I can't speculate exactly in terms of Ohio, not knowing the context better, but it like raises some provocative questions. There have been a lot of studies about pre-K efficacy. And I think, the educational researcher article that I mentioned kind of dives into that topic a little bit more about like, what does this tell us about pre-K efficacy, right?
Great. Yeah, absolutely. We're getting some questions too about, different reasons that some of these differences might have come out. You talked a lot about constrained versus unconstrained skills. And one of our attendees is asking about whether the difference could be due to when kids are older, behavior challenges among kids related to during the pandemic requiring more attention from teachers and less ability or less time to do that high quality language and literacy instruction. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I think that is really a great point. We didn't have data on behavior or socio-emotional factors, mental health factors, but I mean, I just have to think that those played a major role in this as well. Based on what we're hearing from teachers and the experiences that people are having, I mean, I know from talking to my, district people here about the children they currently have in early childhood settings, they're really struggling with behavior. And it's becoming a real problem in terms of keeping teachers in the classroom and making sure teachers feel safe, and also just making sure that everyone in the classroom is able to learn. So I do think that's a real factor. I think, some of it could be that these classroom communities are just looking different than they used to. And kids, we're seeing these widening gaps because kids aren't catching up. They're falling further behind because our learning environments are still really impaired for a variety of reasons. We know, especially for little kids, these developmental domains are so closely intertwined, right? Language has so much to do with self-regulation and behavior. And I think, uh, we likely need some intervention approaches that address multiple factors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that relates directly to the next question, which is about special education services. And you're mentioning
Mhm.
that toward the end in terms of diagnosis and some of these kids not getting diagnosed with disabilities at the rates that we were seeing pre-COVID. So Anne Marie was asking about whether you think these services are sort of in overload with referrals. And do you have any information from your data about lack of referrals for these young learners and how the districts are handling that?
Yeah, when I initially spoke to the district about what we were seeing, this was in the kindergarten year, I believe. And we noticed right away, that there are these huge disparities in the number of kids who were diagnosed with disabilities in the kindergarten year in pre-COVID versus COVID. And they were sort of like, yeah, I mean, we can't do language assessments online. We don't know how to do that. They were still very much putting things into place, and they did feel like children were like slipping between the cracks, right? And that just weren't being identified. And then you know, maybe were being identified later, but maybe not, especially when it came to like language differences. So I do think that that is a huge issue and it's been understudied. We know there's some data and studies that show that, you know, COVID was harder on COVID impacts were larger for kids with disabilities. But I think we're also seeing that people had a lot of trouble accessing services that they were entitled to, and then also that kids weren't diagnosed who needed to be. And I don't know if it's possible with our data, but I would like to understand, you know, which kids should have gotten diagnosed but weren't, and then what their learning trajectory has looked like over time.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be really interesting. Thank you.
Mhm.
We have one question that's a little farther afield, but people are interested in whether you know of any studies on language acquisition for infants or younger children who were born at the beginning of the pandemic. Many of them attended daycares where providers were masked for the entire first year of that child's life. This Elizabeth is mentioning, and wondering if you know of anything for that age range in terms of impacts.
I don't, but that is such a good question. I'm really curious about that too. There have been a couple of studies. There was a study by, she's at University of Houston, and her name is escaping me, one of Trisha Zucker's postdocs. She did a study about language assessment with masks and without masks, and she did not see any significant differences for young kids. But there was another study about the role of masking in children's instruction that had more equivocal results, so thought that maybe it did have some impact. So I think we're still learning a lot about like how those disease mitigation measures may have potentially impacted kids' learning experiences and the social distancing. And, you know, it's tricky because it is like politically sensitive as well. But, you know, I think that research will continue to emerge and I'm curious about it as well. When it comes to, you know, teaching skills like phonological awareness, we know how important like thinking about mouth and tongue placement is and all of that. So I know some teachers wear clear masks and that could be a helpful way to get around it. But it was a difficult time in terms of being able to be close and face to face because of not wanting to spread disease. Thank you for that
Absolutely.
good question.
It looks like Shane Piasta just put the link to that masking paper in the chat for folks
Thank
who are
you.
interested. Sarah, is it Serene?
Yes,
That's
that's it.
out there.
Hmm.
Great.
Yep.
And Shane was also asking about whether these results from your study have been released in publication or in preprint. Should we be keeping an eye out for these in the future? And I know you mentioned that one article that's already out, so we'll definitely get that from you and make sure we can send that out when we send out the recording and the slides. But can you give us a little more information about when we
Yes.
can see more of this in print?
Great question. I was just working on the discussion section before we before we met today. So I'm hoping to get it under review ASAP. That's the answer. I've presented a couple of times at conferences on these
Mhm.
results, but it's not out yet, but I'm hoping to have it out very soon. So yeah, please stay tuned.
Excellent. Very exciting. Well, this has been a wonderful presentation and conversation. Thank you again for sharing your work with us, Dr. Hadley.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks to all of our attendees for joining us today. When you leave the meeting, a very short survey will pop up. Please do fill that out if you're able to. We really do value your feedback and use it to inform our events for the future. Thank you again for joining us and have a great day.